Hello everyone, this is Alazir Chess here to help you to realize your potential. And we're back with another one, guys. We're going to be going over the move 4b4 after the move 4e3 from white. And we're going to be covering that before we get to 4 knight b5 in place of e3 against 3e6 from black. And we're also going to be covering another line that I did not cover in the previous video, which is after a6. If e3, e6, knight to f3, bishop to b4 could be played here, and after a3, bishop takes, pawn takes, c5 from black. We don't want to let black play c4 here, and we don't want to take, which ruins our formation as white. Instead, we can play the move c4, and after c takes, e takes, d takes, bishop takes. Here the move queen to a5 check is no good because of bishop to d2, and after queen back to d8, castles from white, and white is slightly better here. Black has lost time, and the white bishop wasn't doing much on f4 anyway. It's better placed on d2. Also here, after b5, bishop back to d3, bishop to b7, castles and castles. Both sides are fine here. So this is also an alternative to playing the move c5, which just runs into what we covered in the last video after pawn takes, bishop d3, knight c6, castles, and e4. So here after 3e6, e3, bishop to b4. Here, if white plays knight to e2, which is the top move by the engine, castles, a3, black can put the bishop on e7, and now white no longer has any dreams of a Greek gift because the knight is not on f3, where it could hop to g5. And if something like knight to c1, c5, pawn takes, bishop takes, knight to b3, bishop back to e7. Here the computer likes bishop to g3, knight c6. Also playable here is bishop to d3, and after a6 from black, preventing any minor pieces from going to b5. Castles, knight c6. White can play h3 to give the bishop a square to dart back to in the event of e5. Also, this stops any bishop g4 or knight g4 shenanigans after the move e5. And if b5 here from black, bishop back to g3, getting off of that tempo with e5, bishop to b7, rook e1. Here, black has a number of moves. Black can play queen to b6. Black can also try knight to a5. And after changing a set of minor pieces, here white is advised to break in the center to try to liquidate. And if pawn takes, knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, bishop to f6, and after pawn to c3, black is completely equal here and has a number of moves, as you can see, rook fd8, rook ad8, and queen b6, and black is equal in any case. Also here, if you try to avoid e4, you can play knight to e2 to try to keep some life in the position. But after queen to b6, pawn to c3, here black has a number of moves. Knight to d7 to reroute. Also potentially allowing black to play f5. You have knight to e4 here, but that could allow white to double the pawns despite black having the bishop pair. You also have rook f to d8, and you also have rook a to c8 to hold the c7 square, and then rook f to d8, also holding the c file, preventing any breaks. Here white should probably go for a4. On move 5, after bishop to b4, we have h4, and if black plays c5, knight to e2, pawn takes. Here black has a number of moves. Bishop to d7, a3 and bishop to e7 is perfectly fine for black. Also, bishop to d7 stops any knight b5 shenanigans. There's also here knight to c6, and after h5 from white, black can play h6. Rook to h3 does not work because of e5, and after rook e3, knight g4, and white loses material. Also here, after bishop to d3 on move 5 from white, c5 runs into pawn takes pawn, and here you don't want to capture back. You also don't want to take the knight. Instead, knight bd7 is perfectly fine here for black, but we're going to get into what happens if white doesn't play pawn takes pawn. Well, first off here, if knight to e2, you just lose a piece due to c4. If bishop to b5 check, then bishop d7 takes, knight takes, and you help black to get rid of his bad quote-unquote French bishop. And here, if knight to e2, you have queen to b6, black continuing in French style due to the pawn formation f7, e6, d5. And here, if white plays queen to d3, which is the engine's top choice, c4 here, the queen goes back to d1, but getting black to commit to this formation with this connect 4 is not the hottest thing for white, as it's very hard for white to get any play here. White really wants to play for e4 and break at this formation, but if black plays the move knight to h5, after bishop to e5, f6, bishop g3, we can take, and if white opens the h file, it's nothing for black to be worried about, because f5 can be played, locking down e4 and g4. If a3, we can take to gain a tempo, and after knight takes, we even have queen takes b2 here. And after king to d2, which is the engine suggesting to protect the knight, knight to f6, and here rook to b1 doesn't really do much, as after rook takes b7 and castles, it's black who is in control. If white goes for a queen trade, and then trying to get in with rook takes a7, we have knight to e4 check, knight takes, and pawn takes. And after king to e2, a5, rook a4 to stop the a-pawn from moving forward and the rook from expanding its control. And here, you don't have time to go for rook b5 and winning that pawn and trying to get a draw. Rook to f5 comes, or rook to f6. And if rook f5, rook b5, rook af8, and this weakness on f2 costs white the game. Also, if a move like g4, there's rook g5, and if f3, h5, and black is winning if white takes, as king d1 runs into e takes f3, and king f1 runs into e takes f3 or rook takes c2. And here, if we go back to this position after queen b6, if white tries a move like rook b1, we have castles, and after castles, c4, a3, black is perfectly fine after either bishop to d6, trading pieces, or bishop to e7, keeping the dark squared bishops on, as there's no real need to trade pieces here. And here, trading pieces would actually simplify white's task for him, as the knight would get the f4 square, and white can then work on trying to get in f3 and e4. So there's no need to trade the dark squared bishops if you don't want to. As a matter of fact, as a reminder here, I'm going to place bishop to e7 as a good move. Not that bishop to d6 is a bad one. Now, here, after 6 knight f3, if white doesn't take, then there's c4, bishop to e2, knight to e4, and white is busted. For example, h3, knight takes, and if queen to d2, which is a common way to try to get a piece back if there's no way for black to get a nice discovery. But here, there is a nice discovery with knight takes bishop, and after queen takes bishop, knight takes f4, black emerges 2 pieces up. Also, if instead of queen d2, we have pawn takes knight, bishop takes c3, white just loses in exchange. Now, if instead of a3, we have castles immediately, then white loses a pawn, and after knight to c6, knight to e5, knight takes, bishop takes, castles, black is perfectly fine. Black is much better. Now if we go to bishop g5 on move 6, black will just play c4 again, getting this nice pawn chain, and if white exchanges, hitting the queen, the bishop is forced to go back to e2. We can play knight to c6, and white could attempt to play for a stonewall setup without the dark squared bishop and control the e5 square. But we have a few good moves here with bishop to d7, also queen to d8, and also knight to e7, trying to reroute to f5, and this is perfectly fine for black. Also here, if after pawn takes, knight bd7, continuing the main line, knight e2, knight takes c5 here is not good for black. We don't put the knight on d7 to take the pawn back with the knight, because after a3, bishop to a5, b4, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop c7, takes. Here, white can either play h3 to prevent knight g4 after castling kingside, or white could play rook to c1, and in either case, white is equal, and the queen's going to have to move again to e7. So there's a line here that you guys can look at on your own. It's perfectly equal here. So instead, after knight e2, we want to take with the bishop. And now, after castling, we have knight to h5. If white tries to go after our bishop with knight to a4, we can take here, and white has to take back here. And after bishop to e7, we're perfectly fine. We have the bishop pair and an extra central pawn. And in the event of knight takes bishop on c5, white loses a piece due to knight takes knight with check. And after queen takes, knight takes, black is up a piece. Also here, if bishop takes on c5 and h3 from white, black can castle, and knight to b5 is a blunder due to e5, and after bishop to h2, a6 taking the knight back, and then pawn to e4 closes the door on the light squared bishop. So it's very important to keep in mind that e5 and e4 can be played with tempo gains due to the positioning of the bishop on f4 with the knight on e2. The bishop on d3 can get trapped if white plays any wasteful moves. So here, instead of knight to b5, white is going to have to move the dark squared bishop. And if white were to castle here, there's a6 here. Here, e5 doesn't work because here, if bishop to g5, e4, you're not actually trapped here. You have access to the b5 square. And here, bishop to b5 is the only move, as you can see. And that's why black plays the move a6 to set up e5. And after pawn to e4, d4, knight b1, e5, a sample line runs bishop to g3, rook e8, knight to d2, getting that piece back into play. And this is perfectly equal to slightly better for black. And bishop to f8 is one idea. Another idea is pawn to b5, and after a4 taking to open up lines on the queen side against the b and c pawns. Also here, if instead of b5, bishop to f8, f4, knight to h5, queen e1, knight takes, getting the bishop pair, and now after takes and takes, the f file opens, but black can play f6 here, and if bishop c4, king h8, bishop to f7 does nothing due to rook c7, which attacks the bishop and kicks it back, and if it makes a pit stop on d5 to prevent black from playing b5, we can play knight b6, and then we can trade off the bishop. And this is perfectly equal for both sides. Both sides have weaknesses, but black's king is safe. So if we go back to after knight to e2, and we play a6 here, instead of bishop takes c5, which is what we can also look at here, which is what we just went through. And here, a6 is also playable because bishop to g3 could be played by white, and bishop to d6 does not work due to bishop takes c5 as well as b6, because if pawn takes, then we have bishop takes bishop, and if c6, then bishop takes, pawn takes, and bishop takes, and this is just not good as black has the bishop pair, an extra central pawn, and white has nothing good here. Now, after bishop takes c5, we have bishop takes, knight takes, b4, and here black should go back. Again, we don't want to take and allow white to open up the c file, as this would be perfectly fine for white. It's about equal here. Yes, the computer slightly prefers black, but with the light squared bishop blocked by his own pawns at the moment, it's not going to be as good as it could have been. So knight cd7, and here after castles, black is perfectly fine. So what do you guys think of these lines? It's very easy for black to just play knight bd7 for the capture on c5 to happen for white, and the bishop to come back to c5 for black to maintain the bishop pair and to have an extra central pawn. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you guys for watching. Remember to realize your potential and to get better every day. Take care. Peace.